Okay, yeah, I've got a question for both of you. Regarding both papers, I was thinking about, when you were talking, the relationship between something like poesis and science. So both of you have these kinds of turns in your work where you're trying to think about utopianism. So one of the demands of thinking about utopianism is trying to put true forms of goodness in one side and kind of false consciousness or kind of pretenders to goodness on the other side. And I was noticing that both of you, your sense of what utopianism might include is often quite scientific in nature. So Dierdra, you have this turn at the end towards libidinal mirror neurons. And Sophie, you obviously thinking about gestational utopianism. And Sophie, I also noticed that in your paper, you're a little bit suspicious of a kind of mass poetics or mass poesis, mass idiom, things like Jamilia's Instagram up there, which she sort of thinks about the fetus as a tenant. And you also said that we should de-romanticize care. So there's a kind of a sense that romanticization or kind of an inappropriate form of poetics might be what we're kind of trying to move against. And the thing that we're trying to do is a more kind of scientific and sort of technological work. I might have completely mischaracterized both of your positions there, but I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what we think about science and technology versus poesis.
You think I should go first?
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm a bit stuck on I perhaps don't quite understand why Jamila Jamil's landlord gestationism is mass.
Just because it's like mass media and it's like a sort of silly metaphor to call the fetus a tenant. You were kind of saying like the underpinning of that is obviously kind of foolish or absurd. And it probably is.
I think Ros Pachesky insists, I think convincingly, that all reproductive politics is sort of narrative like this. It's sort of narrative claims. I don't think it's absurd. I think it's bourgeois. I'm also making absurd claims, about what a gestator really is. I mean, mine are right, I think with Donna Haraway, whose 80s socialist account of embodiment, I stan. I would say that perhaps I'm a bit suspicious of the distinction between poesis and science. I think it's definitely the case that I operate from the basis that I don't share feminism's historic leeriness of basing things in biology. The semiotic and the material is sort of one fist or whatever, Haraway. I think, yeah. So I think materialist science, Marxist biology is an important thing to defend. The idea of a value-free, scientific account of the placenta is what is absurd, perhaps. People like Richard Lewontin and Lynn Margulis and Haraway are inspirations in full surrogacy now. Things like Haraway's insight into how reproduction in the human species actually works is quite useful. It's not going to win the arguments. Facts will not save us, as Ruha Benjamin said, I think, recently in the war against the proponents of forced gestation. It's not really facts that are going to sort of save us, but our narratives are what counts, I guess. So when Haraway says, reproduction doesn't really happen in the human species, right? Everyone's like, what? I suppose I find that people are often very surprised I don't know, perhaps you'll be surprised. The fetus and the gestator are no more different genetically. There's not like a greater difference in a surrogacy situation than in a natural situation. Like fetuses and gestators are different genetically, full stop. But the amount of discursive emphasis that is put on the differentness of the assisted reproductive technology industry in order to sort of capture certain kinds of pregnancy as work and reinforce the invisibilization of normal pregnancy as non-work is quite remarkable. And you can use science to unpick that narratively.
Thank you.
Well, I've given birth 4 times, and I think I've done as much work as any surrogate. In response to your question, I think my best and most succinct answer would be that I don't distinguish between science and poiesis. That to me, it's all a question of discourse. And I wonder what kind of epistemological maze, I guess that would be a nice try. Sometimes I think it's a cage we entrap ourselves in. I think some people feel like maybe my thought is fatalistic in that sense, and that I don't think at all that it is. I think if you understand the terms of your subjection, that it can be liberating. So I guess that's what I am always after.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, other questions that aren't me?
I think this is a stupid question, but it's really one I want to know the answer to, which is, so it starts with Sophie, but when you were talking about the holding up the fetus and you were trying to say, yes, it's not nothing, it is a form of life, but it's not an overwhelming form of life, right? The other forms of killing animals, right, you mentioned. And so this is the stupid bit of the question. I wondered where you would place something like the Peter Singer argument about if we are making decisions about killing, right? And that there's no prima facie distinction between human and non-human forms of killing. And so maybe bringing that into the rubric of why we're here, that because I've been looking on social media, responses to Monday's decision have been supposedly all the right people are saying, look, little picture, this is not a human, this is not a human, this is not a person, this is not a person, when precisely that rhetoric has been at the heart of speciesism, which is what I really want to ask you about, but then it also has a racial and colonising logic. Like, as long as we have a secure definition of the human, we can include this and this is not human, this is not who we are. So it's originally a question to you about negotiating life, human, animal, and then the racial implications of that. Moving over to Dierdra.
I should probably have read some Peter Singer, just to know what,
Can I just?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was really bad. I guess because I'm Australian, he's one of the other exports.
But he's down the road from me at Princeton, I think.
Right. He used to be down the road from me too. So, but he's made this argument that, and it's an animal rights argument, right? That this life is worth living, this is not a life worth living. And where it got him into trouble was that he argued for infanticide, right? Because that minute you said, well, yes, it's killing, right? And he was like, yes, it's killing, but we kill animals for these reasons. And so we should be able to kill humans for these reasons. And so the reason why I was ashamed to ask the question is that he's now associated with a sort of right-wing non-forced gestation, precisely because it's a utilitarian manufacturing approach about deciding what counts as human. And that's where I wanted to throw it over to both of you, right, on this, to what extent the human, right, counts as a calculus of inclusivity and worthiness, or to what extent one dispenses with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'm a stuck record with my Haraway references. Another point, so there are two things that really stick in my head all the time. There's a point in where she's talking about the laboratory mice and how they suffer, for humanity, for human life, for human medicine. And as I recall reading it at the time, I remember being really struck by the way she rejects any calculus. It's not about figuring out a rationale for it being okay to torture the mice. I think that's a really important premise, right? She's not necessarily got philosophical tools for communists in her recent writing, but I think that understanding is deeply important for sort of anti-eugenic, anti-ableist practice. I think the reason why, I'm different from Peter Singer here, I hope, is that I'm not really saying it is okay to kill the fetus. Like, it's good, right? It's a bit different, isn't it? And I really want a world in which, I can care about fetuses and them not being killed. But that's not this world, So yeah, it's not okay. It's just good for people.
Tim?
Okay, I want to follow up, I think, on that, because the question that, in a way, it's following up on both Connie's question and Claire's question. Connie's question about poesis, Claire's question about sort of Peter Singer and ethics. And one of the most sort of surprising moments in your talk, Sophie, was when you sort of did this experimental rhetorical strategy thing, and you sort of discarded, as I heard you, discarded entirely a kind of ethical discourse, and you sort of asked us to say, well, we could give, fetuses ethical consideration. They can have personhood if we can have publicly funded, healthcare, including publicly funded, abortion. And I wanted to sort of ask you, am I hearing you correctly that ethics, is in a way a non-discourse for you? Are you going as far as that? And how much weight do you want to put onto sort of like the strategy of experimentally developing sort of rhetorics in which to confound the political enemy?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, it's really interesting hearing you. You're probably right. That's probably where I've got to recently. That's my mood. Ethics, nah. But it's funny because I've been engaging with Kathy Weeks a lot. I taught a course on her just now, and she's, come out as a family abolitionist to my delight. So there's this essay she's written in Feminist Theory laying out her case for it. And it's brilliant. And one point that I found amusing when I read it was how cantankerous she is about ethics. And I was wondering, trying to reconstruct in my mind, speculations as to how Kathy Weeks got so anti-ethics. I think I understand why in this terrain she sort of got there. My reaction was perhaps a bit like what I'm hearing from you, Tim, just sort of like, it's a bit, come on, Kathy, like, But because it's sort of in an argument about how polyamory isn't going to do anything for anything, So, and I can see how in that context you can become very anti-ethics. I mean, I'm not convinced that ethics has much purchase in this domain. I mean, the slow forms of killing that matter, that are most, actively violent on this planet are perfectly legal and sort of ethical. I do think, there's never, just to repeat what I just said to Claire, there's never going to be a little litmus test that you can put on a situation it's always going to be political. I think, even in individual instances of, withdrawal from gestational labour. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm glad, after all, that there are legal bioethical apparatuses in place, preventing people from being euthanized when they're non-productive and poor and old. I will think on it. Thank you.
That's a good question. When you say you're against ethics, it doesn't seem to me, that's not what I gleaned from your talk. It seems like you're against a one-size-fits-all model of ethics, but in favor of a contingent kind of
that's probably
circumstantial ethics. Is that accurate?
Maybe we need definitions. Is that, well, yeah. Can someone help us out with a third intermediary reading?
Well, maybe we can kind of keep thinking about this as we get some other questions, because I bet there's lots of other hands that want to go up. I say that's no hands go up.
That's okay.
I didn't know that about John Leguizamo.
Which thing?
That he was in the subway car making jokes. I know him from Romeo plus Juliet. I love that.
Tim.
Thank you. Dierdra, I wanted to ask you about Rivera Kusikanki's thought and about your closing discussion of Richardson. I mean, I haven't seen it, but
You haven't.
no, you sort of celebrated it as, I don't know, some kind of paradigm of utopian miscegenation or something like that. So I wondered how you see that, if I've got you right, but I wonder how you see that relating to official celebrations of sort of mixed identity in some Latin American nations, mestizaje and that kind of thing. And particularly in a place like Bolivia, where Rivera Kusikanki was quite critical of MAS and, of the official kind of plurinational ideology of the nation.
Right. That is such a complicated question. My good friend Joshua Lund has a great book on mestizaje and its uses in Mexico as kind of a discursive apparatus for defining the nation. If you go back in time and you look at somebody like Jose Vasconcelos, for example, who in 1925, he published The Cosmic Race, which was what I referenced very, very quickly at the end of the talk in the context of Bridgerton. So the Mexican Revolution triumphs, and he's the Minister of Education. He sends Diego Rivera and Siqueiros and all the muralists to go to the south of Mexico to learn to paint in an indigenous style. Indigeneity and mestizaje in particular is cultivated as kind of like the future of the nation. He writes a book called The Cosmic Race, saying that it is the synthesis and the apex of the fifth race that is the fusion of all the others and the betterment. And so a lot of people have called him essentially a fascist sort of racial ideologue of his moment. This is what's going on in the world. It's like race is what's on everybody's mind, and how can the nation be defined in that way? So someone like Josh Lund continues that analysis, and throughout the 20th century, you might find more of a kind of aesthetic approaches on Blackness, for example, in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, as a kind of discursive resistance to the kind of like white Batista government that has been toppled, associated with imperialism. So races, it's really complicated and tricky. Kusikanki says that that those who cultivate a certain fixed racial identity, even if it's one that's mestizo, are essentially, as I said, sort of trafficking in the terrain, the carving up and territorial sort of masculine sort of geographical planting your flag ownership. She talks about, I'm going to butcher this because it's in Quechua, but she calls it chichinax, which is instead it is a sort of pointillism kind of image of so many colors, especially white and black, which I don't think should be understood in the Bolivian case as a sort of allusion to race, but more of color, and how when you step away, you see gray, but when you look up close, you see all of the individual elements that retain their specificity. And this is the kind of mestizaje that Rivera Kusikanki is wanting to move towards, and what she considers feminist, as opposed to this kind of masculinist, still sort of conquest mentality, even if it's in the name of mestizaje. Oh, thank you for that question.
Yeah, Kevin.
I don't know if this is a question, but I'm wondering, Sophie, if this captures some of what I think I heard you say. I'm thinking back to Connie's good question, that in some ways capitalism's brutality is based on a set of rules that are unequally applied. So no killing, this is life should be protected. And we know that those aren't. If those are its rules, they're unequally applied. And so you're advocating a poesis of a kind of science, of becoming comfortable with a wider application of those rules so as to be able to more honestly grapple with life as it is lived and experienced. And so it seems as if the poesis of the way in which you use science is in an attempt to create a better set of rhetorics about those rules on which capitalism is based. And that there is indeed something ethical about that, even if it seems like it sounds unethical based on, right, the kind of standards of the ways in which we understand the ethical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. Thank you. I apologize if it sounded like I misunderstood. I probably did misunderstand Connie's question. I think because I use the word sympoiesis to think. I'm stuck in this task of thinking about it as a very material, fleshy, not fully controlled. I mean, gestational, productive process. So it's been many years since I studied literature, and poesis maybe I associate with that world. I think, maybe I need to row back my. I'm not sure that I said you can have fetal personhood if we can have free universal abortion, although perhaps it does amount to that. I think possibly I should not have said that. I don't think you can have fetal personhood. I was interested in the thought experiment of, rivers, chickens, oceans, forests. I've never been particularly convinced. I'm not sure. Ashley can tell me how powerful those thoughts and beliefs and demands have been in the context of decolonial conservation and ecology. I suppose I was maybe being a bit glib, like maybe if we had, if we were in a position where, personhood was understood as more than human, then it would sort of not make any difference whether we understood fetuses as well to be persons. I think the point is, for me, that this terrain needs to be discussed as political way more. It's generally discussed as ethical. So I'm not really, I'm not saying people, aren't saying smart things in the domain of the ethical, but I want to talk about power, gestator power, sort of full stop, right? I think you summarized my argument very well. what I hope I managed to put across. The phrase ethical killing is one I want to kind of not reduce my argument. It's just that puts me in a very Singer kind of place. But killing is sort of everywhere. It's structurally and systematically and intimately always happening everywhere. It's saturating everything. I'm not interested in going around saying ethical killing, unethical, it's all unethical. I suppose that seems like a dead end to me.
Yeah, Kevin.
It also strikes me that part of the beautiful harmony between your two talks might be, Dierdra, at the place where you were saying in the very beginning that we so often fail to co-articulate race and gender at the same time, and you also claim that as a failure of your own. And so where I see an intersection is, if indeed the site of so much of the harm and violence of the world is in the instantiation of race and gender, then so often our capacity to think about trying to undo those harms means we have to go deeply towards thinking racially and genderedly, except that thinking racially and genderedly reinforces some of the kind of rhetorics or the very science of capitalism in a way, and yet we are. I'm sitting here as a person who's racialized, Black, gendered, male. We also need to be able to think that, because there's some everyday exigencies that depend on our capacity to appreciate and think and respond to the world through those terms. And I think actually in listening to your two talks, there's a third talk about ways of trying to figure out how to, I don't know how to finish this, almost how to deepen and also suspend the logics that are destroying us without that suspension, making it impossible to try to also think about the day-to-day realities of those logics. And I feel now I'm not articulating this clearly, but I think there's actually something quite dynamic about thinking with both of your talks in regards to that comment, Dierdra, that you made. And that indeed, I saw your talk then trying to work through how to possibly think and talk those two things at the same time. So Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I say something? Yeah,
Yeah, of course.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I think that capitalism sets up. It keeps us in these identity categories, right? These identity buckets. It's not, I mean, I say, yes, it's my personal failing, but I think it's like a structural one that's imposed on all of us. So for example, if you do like I don't know if you've ever done, it's kind of fun and kind of depressing from this sort of structural, we are trapped in these categories kind of way. But there's an exercise that's like a flower power, or power flower, where you draw a little flower with different petals, identifying each petal, giving it like a characteristic of your identity. I'm a woman, I'm white, I'm a mother, I'm a professional, right? And at the center of this is what you perceive to be the center of that power and you place yourself with respect to that center. So for example, I'm a woman, I know that men, culturally speaking, have more power. I'm not at the center of that petal, right? So I would draw visually something that's further away from that, right? This was how the exercise was explained to me at any rate. And so by the end of this exercise, you have a flower with different petals, and you can see visually where you rank yourself on each one of these characteristics with respect to this imaginary sort of figure that holds all of the cultural power. And I think that that's what I was trying to get at, and that's why I think Quijano is so useful for me, because he identifies that this center of power is and continues to be racialized, gendered, has a specific geography, right? And that therefore, when any one of us is trying to gain power, we are always leveraging and jockeying with respect to that perceived point of dominance. And so how then can you reject all of that? And it interpolates you, right? You can't really get away from it. It would be nice to say, like, no, I reject all categories categorically. But that's not what the system allows us to do, right? Identity politics keep us categorized, and they also keep us in competition with each other. You know, you watch a special like Dave Chappelle, and his like congratulates the LGBTQ community for doing so much better, quote unquote, than the Black community in terms of the struggle for rights. Like, wow, like you see this, that in so many places, culturally speaking, it's perceived as a sort of zero-sum race or competition or struggle, and that we are all everyone who is not white, male, European, Eurocentric, in the center of that is competing with each other to try to get to that place. Right, and I think that's what I was trying to draw out in my talk. Not that I don't want it, I don't idealize it, but I think that to not face it squarely and see it and understand so that you can see its effects, and then try to figure out how can we work against them, and how can a sort of silly show like Bridgerton maybe be doing something kind of radical. That is, I think that's a way of getting to that type of analysis.
If nobody else has another question, I wanted to ask you, Sophie, something. And I'm afraid it comes from not having read enough of your work, but I guess it's just a sort of question about science and the idea of science for the people, because you use a lot of scientific terminology, and it seems like the promise of science, along with radical social transformation, is some kind of liberation. So I guess I just wondered, because so often we see science in quite dystopian terms today. I mean, think about the resonance of Haraway's Cyborg, after so many movies and things like that. So, I mean, have you been in dialogue with a lot of folks in the scientific establishment about the possibilities for kinds of transformations? Is there a movement within, that world? What kinds of changes are people looking for and trying to make? And how can the rest of the radical universe help make those transformations?
Oh, thank you. Well, short answer, no, not in dialogue with many people in what I would call the scientific establishment. Or, honestly, the biobag researchers, for example. I've written about this at Logic magazine. There's, there's a lab really close to where I live where it's one of the places, Philadelphia, for whatever reason, is one of the places where ectogenesis has been developed for decades and decades. Ectogenesis is, something that culture and literature has imagined for over 100 years. It's this thing that people are confident. And actually, in the 1920s, people from right on the left communist side of the political spectrum, all the way through to fascists, were convinced this particular technology and science was going to be for them, and I find that really interesting. And it doesn't exist, right? It's beginning to perhaps slightly come into existence now, but people have been writing and fabulating as though it exists for over 100 years. There's very, very little, feminist, communist, agency involved, right? in the scientific development of ectogenesis today. You'll be shocked to hear it's actually pro-life interests, right? So this is, an enemy technology in its current instantiation. And when I bothered the scientists at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia about this, they were initially quite keen to talk to someone who seemed sort of maybe open to it, but then they realized that I was into it for feminist reasons, not preemie defense reasons, and then they just completely stonewalled, absolutely stonewalled me. And I think it's interesting that, people who have been handling fetal cells down the corridor from these guys, anecdotally, I heard they had their funding cut under the Trump administration, whereas the people, gestating sheep fetuses in bags with a view to this year doing it with human preemies were getting loads of funding because the rationale there is to remove the woman in their imaginary from the scene of gestation, not to give her a break, not to allow her to stop working if she wants to, on the contrary, to remove her autonomy over the symbiogenetic process of anthrogenesis. My perhaps failing endeavor to re-up the Cyborg Manifesto and to go against its many, many misinterpretations as being about a kind of techno-euphoric embrace of, I don't know, the android or something, when it was just as much about the animal and the virtual as it was about the machine, is really where I'm coming from when people ask me, there's a podcast at Cambridge called Feminism and, no, what's it called? The Good Robot, about feminism and technology, and they ask feminist theorists, what do you think about feminism and technology? And I suppose it's a really good question, and it's also technology needs to be defined very carefully, doesn't it? Because I do think, people forget how much the machine is us, but I was talking to you at lunch about how Firestone, the demon child of women's liberation and scapegoat and figure who has become synonymous with ectogenesis, machine uteruses, despite the fact that what she actually says is that in the hands of the current powers, the capitalist powers, any form of development of ectogenetic capability would be a nightmare. I think that's interesting. I find the need to keep stabbing the corpse of women's liberation and long 60s utopianism is interesting. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm techno-curious. There are people, sorry, one last thing. Obviously, misoprostol, mifepristone, that's citizen science right now. Citizen science, people are, sharing videos of how to make it yourself, right? It's an anti-ulcer medication. You can get it on veterinary distribution websites, right? No, it's not necessarily, you don't want to necessarily be taking loads of dog misoprostol, but you could, with a bit of guidance from your comrade scientists on a range of different websites and networks. So I am in touch with those members of the scientific anti-establishment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much to our speakers. I think that's all we have time for today, and thanks for the questions. Let's give them a round of applause.